Hey, welcome everybody to Not So Famous Achievers. Weekly conversations with some of the world's most amazing but not so famous achievers on what they did and how they did it and what you can learn from their journey. With your hosts, Will Christ and Robert White. Hey, guys.
Well, welcome to our conversations with the not so famous achievers today. And we've got a great conversation coming up with someone who has had a big hand in helping us move towards solar energy and now how to transmit that energy across the country. So welcome, Troy.
Thank you, Will. It's good to be on the show today.
So Troy Helming, he's going to tell us about what he had before, which is a large array of solar plants and generated a lot of electricity. But Troy, pick up the story there and tell us how you got to where you are.
Sure, yeah. So I've actually been in solar since 1980. You can believe that. So 4 decades. I'm in my 50s, so obviously I was a kid when that happened, and it was my job in junior high and high school. One of my main chores was to maintain our solar heating system on my dad's dream home. So it heated our water, our pool, our hot tub, and in the wintertime we'd shut off the pool and it would heat the air in the house with the 4 furnaces had a heat exchanger in it where the hot solar fluids would flow through. So I've been around solar a long time. Started the first wind company in Kansas called TradeWind Energy in the 1990s. Sold that in 2004. It was bought by Enel Green Power, a huge Italian utility, but it became the largest wind developer in the United States by 2017. So that's part of my legacy. And then I switched to solar, also wrote a book, The Clean Power Revolution. But don't buy it. It'll put you right to sleep. But anyway, I do talk about how we need to add about 170 new transmission lines in this country to unlock a lot of cheap wind and solar power. Not only lower our cost of energy, but clean up the air, clean up the water, reduce the mercury and lead and cadmium that goes into our water and our food from all of the coal plant emissions. So I've been around the industry a long time, public speaker, those kinds of things. And then I came up with a pretty cool idea, as we have talked about briefly, Will, in 2015. I don't know if you want me to share that now or...
Well, let's set it up what this is, because what you told me was that the problem we have right now is not generating electricity, because with solar and wind, the price is coming down. We're going to have lots of electricity generated organically, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And the real problem is this transmission.
It is. The costs are coming down. I mean, if you look at the extraction industry, oil, gas, and coal, those prices generally are kind of going up. There's volatility, of course. Gas prices change every day, right? And technology can help lower costs for a time, but generally that trend is going up. Whereas with the technology, like, whether it's cell phones or, flat screen TVs or wind or solar, that cost curve goes down. The more adoption you have of technology, the price drops. And those two lines have now crossed. And so solar is cheaper than coal and nuclear everywhere in the United States. It's cheaper than nuclear. It's cheaper than coal everywhere. And wind and solar are cheaper than natural gas in about 46 states. So it's not about the economics or even finding better technology. We have the technology and the price is right. So yes, you're right, Will. It's transmission. There's so much wind and solar, wind in the Midwest, primarily along kind of the Great Plains and the wind belt, and solar in the South and the West, particularly in the Southwest. But there just are not enough transmission lines to get that cheap energy to our cities.
Isn't that what happened in Texas in the deep freeze?
Exactly right. Yeah, their system was designed for a lot of different scenarios, but they never really anticipated a deep freeze that would be cold enough with weird climate change and climate weirding, whatever you want to call it, going on. The jet stream from the Arctic went all the way down to Texas and it froze all of the natural gas in the pipelines. The gas could not move in the pipelines and the pumps. A lot of the pumps are not electric power, they're gas pumps. So they're burning gas to pump gas. And those pumps failed in the cold weather, which caused a problem in the wintertime earlier this year. And similarly in the summer, there's some times where the droughts are so bad that they can't pull cooling water from the rivers for cooling power plants. So some of the power plants are going offline, and yeah, they're having a lot of issues, and it's mainly because Texas has its own grid. There's the eastern grid, the western grid, and Texas. Because they might want to succeed from the country at any moment, right? So they have to have
and they can break into 5 states immediately, just like that.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. But anyway, the great state of Texas has its own grid, and historically it's been fine. But with some of these weather anomalies, it's becoming apparent that they have vulnerabilities there. So better transmission would solve that problem. If we could have exported solar power from the West Coast to Texas during those moments, they would have been fine. Similarly, wind from the Midwest. And there's just very little exchange of energy between the eastern grid, the western grid, and the Texas grid. And that needs to be solved.
Yeah. So does that make sense, Robert?
One of the things I've learned is I started out in life thinking I was going to figure everything out, which is hilarious when you get to this age. But I really did, deep in my heart, I thought, one day I'm going to figure everything out. And then along came a guy named Peter Wenge, who taught me about general systems theory, that everything is too complicated to understand, all these big systems. And certainly our energy supply usage network is incredibly complex. So for me, listening to Troy is educational. But Troy, what I always look for is the leverage point in complex systems. What is the decision, the action that with 1 unit of energy, speaking of energy, you get 10 units of results. So I'm curious, what's the leverage point here that would make a new idea work? So that we could really use all of these new technologies.
So the leverage point, that's a great way of putting it, Robert. The leverage point is to find a way to get transmission lines built in less than 15 years, because that's typically how long it takes. And the reason for that is companies that are doing it, which are typically utilities or large independent power producers or transmission companies. And there are a lot of privately owned transmission lines already in the United States. Not all of them are owned by utilities. There are privately owned transmission, but it takes so long because they have to get all the permits and they have to find ways to convince communities along the way to accept, frankly, an ugly, big old transmission line going through their community. And that's very difficult. There was a company in Houston called Clean Line that ultimately failed. They had raised hundreds of millions of dollars and were developing 4 big transmission line projects to unlock primarily wind power, cheap wind power, and move it to the East Coast. And they failed because there were certain counties in Arkansas and Missouri and certain cities that vehemently opposed these new transmission lines because there was very little benefit to that community, right? It was just passing through. And ultimately killed those projects and killed the company. It was very sad. So I came up with an idea in 2015, and I'll just share the story because it's kind of fun. I had at the time 80 employees. We were developing lots of solar farms all over California, North Carolina, Minnesota, and a few other states. And one of our projects was just downsized by 75% because the power lines, the grid just couldn't handle it. They were too old and creaky. And so we had to reduce the size by 75%. And the utility had agreed to pay, by this much. But anyway, that was really frustrating. So we had a happy hour. We were kind of commiserating. And one of our solar employees, Dominic, he's a former Navy SEAL. And he was bragging to his girlfriend at this happy hour about how he and his SEAL team used to approach enemy ships by cutting a hole through the side of the ship underwater, and then they would go in and take over the ship, right? He was like, yeah, we were using this plasma cutting torch. It was 20,000 degrees. I think it'd take your arm off. And we're all like, oh, dude, you're such a badass, or you're tough. Sorry if I can't say that on the air here, but anyway, we were all impressed. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night. I was like, plasma, 20,000 degrees. I wonder if that's hot enough to melt rock. Because if we could go underground with these power lines, which has always been 10, 20 times more expensive than overhead, but if we could somehow solve this and go underground where people don't have to see it and worry about it, we could follow public rights of way, roadways, rail lines, and things like that. That might solve it. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I was up all night researching. I couldn't find anybody doing this. I didn't even know if it was possible. Long story short, hired an engineering firm that specializes in plasma. They're publicly traded. They did a feasibility study that said, yes, it'll work. Number 2, you can bore at 1 kilometer per day. Number 3, nobody else is doing this that we're aware of. And number 4, here's what your operating costs are, replacing your electrodes every 6 months or so. And I looked at that math, talked to some other engineering firms that have expertise in underground utility lines. And long story short, we're up to 200 times faster and 90 to 98% cheaper than any conventional boring and drilling technology.
And you don't have to worry about hurricanes.
Bingo. Or ice storms, or even earthquakes, earthquakes. So I get this question a lot, and we've raised millions of dollars in 2 different versions of the company here and over the years. And some of the engineers are like, okay, but what about, or VCs, or what about earthquakes? So I always say, all right, if you're on the ocean and a big tidal wave is coming, would you want to be on a cruise ship trying to face into the huge tidal wave, or would you rather be in a submarine? Submarine, of course, right? So during earthquakes in Japan or Mexico City or whatever, very little damage ever happens to the subway systems. The damage happens as the energy waves propagate up to the surface.
Very good. Well, I know we could get into a lot of conversation about that technology and about the issue and all of that stuff. With Will and I, what we generally do is to try to look at the journey of an entrepreneur or somebody just running a company, running a major part of a company, and kind of what's worked and what's hasn't worked. And as a general flow, it's also to take a look at what hasn't worked in your journey as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, and what you learned from it, how you got through it. The story. I mean, you've had a fascinating life, and starting at a very young age. So what about your journey personally and professionally?
Yeah, so my father and most of my aunts and uncles are entrepreneurs. And so I guess it's kind of in our blood a little bit. And I saw that example growing up and learned, as you said, at an early age, that you kind of have to have the stomach for it. It's tough. You don't have that steady income. There's lots of peaks and valleys. So despite being mentally prepared for it, I think I was frankly a little too arrogant in my 20s.
No.
I was like, it'll be fine. I'll be able to do this. Yeah. And then life happens and you bloody your nose a few times. So, but yeah, I went to work out of business school for AT&T and did really well there. And learned, I think that's very important if you do want to be an entrepreneur, to work for another company, even a big company for a time. Learn what you're good at. What you're not good at is even more important. Learn what your passions are, what you like, and your style and so forth. And so I did that. And then I started my own company in 1992, telecommunications, because, that was the industry I started in with AT&T and had to eat a lot of ramen noodles and hot dogs and PB&J. It was really hard. It was way harder than I thought it would be. I made a few sales and wasn't smart enough to set money aside or enough money aside for those times when there was a dry spell, where the customer revenue was either zero or close to it. So that would be probably one of the more challenging times, but eventually got that company built up. I think we had 33 or 34 employees at our peak, and we were the top distributor of Lucent Technologies hardware in the Kansas City area, and we had a Nextel wireless dealership and learned a lot. And then I read an article that said Kansas, Texas, and North Dakota had enough wind energy theoretically to power the whole country. And I was like, okay, I grew up in a solar powered house. I know it can work. It saved us a lot of money on our natural gas bill. So solar wasn't cost effective yet for the masses, but maybe wind is the thing to do. So I sold my telecom company and put that money into starting the first wind farm company in Kansas. Made lots of mistakes. Again, more ramen noodles and PB&J. But Eventually, eventually did well. A lot of hard work, a little bit of luck. I find the harder I work, the luckier I get. And ultimately raised several $1 million of angel investment capital, and then institutional capital came in after that.
Wow, that's a lot in just a few words. So thank you. My first major business was built in Japan, and I slept on a partner's sofa for 8 months, sent my family back to the U.S. So I identify with that. And guess what my food of choice was?
Ramen noodles.
Well, admittedly, the real thing, and there was a lot of real thing around me in Tokyo, is a lot better than what comes in the little plastic tub. But it's still ramen, and after a few days of it, it gets pretty boring.
Indeed, it does.
Well, so talk a little bit, Troy. Talk a little bit about what you see moving forward with your boring device. Talk a little bit about what you. How is that going to help us?
Yeah, for sure. So the name of that company is called Earth Grid, because we're building a grid, a new transmission grid. And our audacious, ambitious goal is to build a super grid that's all underground in the U.S. that would include power lines and fiber lines, serve a lot of rural, underserved, and tribal communities along the way with broadband, and do what we talked about earlier, which is provide the transmission capacity, the superhighway for clean electrons, if you will, that connects the eastern grid, the western grid, Texas, and really unlocks all of that really cheap wind and solar power that then can be delivered to our cities. So the company was formed about 5 years ago, and we bootstrapped it, built kind of a prototype machine, tested it in granite and really hard rock like basalt, limestone, sandstone, soil, clay, you name it. And then had another company that we formed that was kind of an affiliate, raised some more money, built machine number 2. But back to the original company, and that company has been focused most recently for the last year or so on getting the utility filings done. So we're now approved as a utility in California, Nevada, and Idaho. We have utility filings in a handful of other states in the West, and we're going to actually take that all the way to the East Coast. And what that means is, as a utility, we get preferred, some might say guaranteed rights of way along public roadways for our underground tunnels. And so the idea is we're going to go deep beneath all of the spaghetti of other utilities that might already be there near the surface. We're going to go 30 meters deep, which is around 100 feet. That'll be in harder rock because we can go fast. Like I said, a kilometer per day per machine. So we can bore really quickly, and we don't have to change out drill bits 5, 10, 15 times a day like conventional technologies. We just are vaporizing the rock and breaking it into little kind of either cornflake-sized bits or vapor. And when that vaporized rock cools, it rains or precipitates into kind of a silt or sand, and we can just blow all that out with vacuums and air jets. So it's a really cool process. Seeing it in action is quite amazing at our industrial testing facility in Richmond, California. We're going to be unstealthing the company in a big way next year, but some of this is already public. The fact that we're filed as a utility, the patents are being 3 new patents are going to be published next month, and so some of this is getting out. But this technology will enable what we're calling infrastructure 2.0.
Wow.
So when you think about that, do you think that there will be tunnels connecting all cities, or will this be like the trunk and it comes out of that and gets above ground? Or I'm thinking of Laguna Beach here. We've argued about putting our utilities underground. This sounds like a more significant project that you're talking about.
We actually think we're going to be so busy doing both, and there's room for probably 100 companies like ours in this space, to improve our infrastructure. And I should point out, for your listeners that don't know this, the American Society of Civil Engineers, every couple of years, they rate infrastructure in the United States. do either of you want to take a guess at what the average grade has been? Over the last,
is this a 1 to 10, 1 to 5?
Like in school they used to use A, A, B, C, D, or F.
I think we're at least a D.
That's right. Yeah, the average grade has been D minus, D plus. C minus has been the best grade we've gotten over the last several decades. We've done a pretty poor job of investing in our infrastructure in this country. And so our plan is to have regional and neighborhood and transmission type tunnels. And we have a signed letter of intent with an e-commerce company, a startup company that's working with the huge e-commerce companies that's going to use tubes to move parcels directly to people's homes through either pneumatically or with robots. So imagine having in your kitchen or your garage a little mailbox kind of thing where parcels just pop right in there. And maybe there's another one right next to it that you open it up and it's a vacuum and you pop your bags of trash or recycling or compost or electronic waste in there and it goes off to some central facility where they're using robots to sort it all. This is the future that we want to create, and this technology that allows the really fast and really cheap undergrounding can do it. So yeah, we want to underground those ugly neighborhood power lines in Laguna Beach and communities all over the world, really.
Troy, are you familiar with the work of Buckminster Fuller?
Absolutely.
Bucky was, I only got to meet him once, but he's one of my heroes. And I one of the things I'm most proud of is I got to write a chapter in a book about his life and his impact on me and others. But one of his sayings, and I'm not going to get it word for word, but it's that it's trying to improve the existing is difficult. Creating something new is it's the breakthrough. And it sounds like what you guys are doing is it's really looking at the issue in such a totally different way. I think that applies to many people in many industries. The Buddhists say that fish don't describe water very well. Whatever we're swimming in, it's pretty hard to get out of that and to see things in a new way. So I really want to acknowledge you and your team. I mean, you're obviously seeing things in a really different way.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey, but over the last 5 years, as I've thought about the possibilities that this technology can enable, I guess the opposite of the sky is the limit. The ground is the limit because, think about it. Driving around, it's 2D. You can go X and Y. You can turn left or right, but you can't drive up into the sky or go down under the ground. And Elon Musk has helped to bring underground tunnels, to the forefront of modern day pop culture a little bit, which is great. So I'm grateful to him for that. But underground is 3D. You can have tunnels that, stack on top of tunnels of all different sizes. We're also talking to some of the Hyperloop companies and departments of transportation about high-speed rail going underground or Hyperloop. Ultimately, we could have a tunnel from New York City through Iceland and Greenland to Europe for a high-speed maglev train or a Hyperloop, either one. That could be a fast and cheap way to travel between continents.
Wow. Amazing. So I think it's time to take a deep breath and take a break here. Let's hear from the people who sponsor us, and then we're going to come back and get some more, Troy. Is that fair?
That sounds great.
Well, we're going to give you one quick thought here that plays into what we've been talking about here today. Our two hosts have lived extraordinary lives and been extraordinary entrepreneurs, and Robert White's certainly one of them. He mentors extraordinary entrepreneurs and executives just like you, people who want better results from their leadership performance. He shows them how to turn those results into increased personal joy and satisfaction as well. Robert founded and led two large training industry success stories. He's been there and done that, and his experience will help you find and achieve that extraordinary success you seek in your life. So why wait? Reach out and see what Robert can do for you today. Just email him at robert@extraordinarypeople.com, robert@extraordinarypeople.com, and start living the extraordinary life you've earned.
Does your company have a clear vision? Do you have the right people in the right seats? Are you consistently getting the results you want and enjoying the journey? If not, consider EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System. EOS is a set of simple concepts and practical tools used by more than 100,000 companies around the world to clarify, simplify, and achieve their vision. Schedule your free 90-minute meeting with an EOS implementer at eosworldwide.com today. That's eosworldwide.com.
And now back to our show.
So, Troy, talks about what you see as the future of your company. What the next 5 years? Can you tell us a little bit about what it's going to look like 3 years from now?
Yeah, well, a lot of people ask kind of when's your first big tunnel going to be done? And so I'll just start with that. We're in the process of raising some additional equity capital right now, and we believe that we'll get that wrapped up in the next few months. A lot of interest out there, a tremendous amount of interest. And then we'll order all of the equipment for machine number 3 that we're going to build that will actually be a field version. And we hope to start building our first tunnels for our signed customer contracts that we already have in hand by mid-2022 to late 2022. Once we have the first substantial tunnel built, we'll really be able to unstealth and the perceived risk or unproven tech risk will diminish quite a lot, and we'll probably have our phone ringing off the hook to do a lot. And so then the challenge will be scaling up and building enough machines to keep up with demand. Already our demand exceeds supply because our supply is zero and we have lots of sun. So 3 years from now, fast forwarding, we have already mapped out pathways and customer routes that would connect Northern and Southern California with utility tunnels. And we'll start with utility and then move to transportation. In 3 years is when we'll start our transportation tunnels. But over the next 3 years, we plan to develop and build a very large loop from Northern California to Southern California, and then going east into the Texas market from the LA basin to solve some of the Texas grid challenges, going back north through Texas, through the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, up to Sidney, Nebraska, and along the way pick up a tremendous amount of new wind resource generation, and then head back west from Sidney, Nebraska, which, by the way, is where one of the grid DC interties is located that connects the eastern grid and the western grid. But again, it's a very small amount of energy that can transfer back and forth to solve problems in either side. It's, a few hundred megawatts at most. And we want to increase that by at least one order of magnitude, possibly, by 20 or 30x. Anyway, but head from Nebraska back west to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, through Reno as well. And so that will be a big loop. And we expect to have that loop done within 3 years. And that will connect the eastern grid, the western grid, the Texas grid, solve, a lot of challenges there, and probably be able to add something like about 5 gigawatts, which is 5,000 megawatts of new clean energy capacity to those grids. And to put that in perspective, a typical very large nuclear or coal plant is about 1 gigawatt in capacity. And we're talking about adding, at least 5 of those just in this first phase, and then ultimately being able to add tens of gigawatts to that same loop.
Plus the flexibility.
Precisely. And there will be some energy storage along the way. And what's nice is if you have a big, powerful transmission line over a large, diverse geographic area like that, the wind is always blowing somewhere, right? So it kind of balances out the intermittency. And you can do time zone shifting. So, for example, when the sun is still shining in California, but solar production has fallen off a cliff in the Midwest, in say Dallas and Chicago or wherever, we can export that sunshine to the east and cross 2 time zones there, and vice versa. When solar falls off a cliff in California and we hit our peak ramping, when everybody's coming home, from work and plugging in their phones and their laptops, turning on the ovens and lights and everything, we can import wind power from the Midwest, which we really can't do today, at least not very much of it. So it solves a variety of problems.
When we think about it, this is other form, a subset of the globalization, isn't it? We are becoming much more connected.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. And bringing the world closer, making it smaller with, not just the power lines, because the sun's shining everywhere if you connect the whole world, right? So a global super grid is the ultimate goal. And that's been talked about. There's a lot of organizations that have proposed that, and the value proposition is enormous. So it's been an idea for decades. We didn't come up with that, but we have the technology that can finally enable that, connecting continents to move power around and, again, wean the world off of dirty fossil fuels that cost a lot more and have that volatility, which is hard on economies and, of course, causes all kinds of health and environmental damage. But it's not just that. It's also the communications, making our broadband available to communities all over the world, and ultimately transportation. We have a design for an 8-meter diameter tunnel. So that's roughly 25, 26 feet in diameter. That's enough for a 2-lane highway or 2 tracks of a high-speed rail or whatever. And so maybe having twin tunnels like that, crisscrossing continents, so you could go from California to New York and stop along the way in Chicago or any city you want to in the Midwest. And we're talking about being able to do that cheaply and safely, for like $20, $30, something like that, to go from coast to coast. And then why stop there? Pop over to London if you want to, by going through the basalt, which is the predominant rock under the ocean, all the way to Europe.
I remember the golden spike in Utah when the East and the West came together with the trains. I mean, it was primarily the Chinese immigrants who were the laborers to put it together. But nevertheless, we see those folks, the industrialists, standing there pounding in that golden spike when they connected it. And that's something about what you're talking about now, with that kind of enormous change when you connect these grids, right?
That's right. It really is. It's almost hard for people outside of the energy industry who aren't Sparkies to appreciate how significant this would be for our grid. Not just the reliability, because our grid is actually quite a bit less reliable than the European grid. A lot of that is because they do a lot more undergrounding than we do. So not just reliability, but also cost. I mean, imagine for the first time in our lives, energy prices steadily going down rather than up.
Could I encourage you to change one word in what you just said?
Sure.
You said this would be, and I want to encourage you to say it will be.
It will be. Right. Yeah, you are right. Thank you. See, even at 53, I'm still learning.
Well, I mean that whole thing, we spend so much of our time in the speculative rather than in the predictive. And I just think that the kind of things you're doing, they're very predictable. I mean, you get the, $300,000 or $400,000 additional dollars in angel investment, and then you're ready, and you're ready to go then, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we're raising a little bit more angel capital. We've raised about 1.5 million so far. Raise a little more angel, and then we have some VCs that want to lead a big round. Excuse me. And then it's off to the races. You're right. Nothing's going to stop us. So we will do this. We now have so much interest that it's only a matter of executing the business plan now.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so exciting is as we could talk about the stories about how you got here, and those are important. But at this point, we're talking about what is going to happen.
Right.
And we can begin to think about the effect that's going to have, you said, on just basic energy rates, electrical rates, the displacement that's going to have of the gas industry, the coal industry, the electrical generating plants that depend upon those fossil fuels. The consequences of that are enormous in terms of health, well-being, all of those. But that is going to happen.
You're right. It is. It's exciting. We're living in exciting times with technology changing our lives in so many ways. So yeah, this is really not all that much different from some of the other technology that's being rolled out.
And this is not something that a few developers are going to be sitting in a dark room putting together. This is a major industrial project, right?
It is. It's obviously very capital intensive. It's a lot different than building software platforms. A lot of CapEx, a lot of hardware, a lot of steel going into our robot and enabling us to do this. So, but hey, look, this is what I've been doing my whole career for the most part is infrastructure, starting in telecommunications and then moving to energy. I've built companies that have built something like 15 gigawatts of wind and solar farms, which represents over $20 billion of direct investment. And if you look at the indirect and induced economic impact of that, that's probably close to 60 or $70 billion of economic impact. And it's all industrial stuff. So yeah, some people call me a modern day industrialist.
Yes, and what do you anticipate in terms of 5 years from now? How many jobs will have been created because of this?
Oh goodness, yeah. I mean, if you look at the number of jobs in solar or clean energy compared to other industries, like for instance, there's something like I think it's 1.8 million jobs in clean energy. Just solar alone is something like 300,000 jobs compared to maybe 55,000 jobs in the coal industry. A lot of people don't realize how many jobs have already been created in clean energy. Well, if we're going to add another 5 gigawatts because of our loop, just in that kind of phase one, we're talking about something like for wind, solar, and transmission, at least another 50 to 60,000 jobs. I'd have to do the math. We do have economic analyses of each individual project. But then as you start to increase the capacity of these lines, because once the tunnel's already built, it's pretty easy to add more conductors, more wires into the tunnel, right? To increase the capacity. So ultimately, I could see 1 million plus jobs being created just from this one loop to allow all of these new wind farms and solar farms to get built. And of course, they have to be maintained and operated too.
So here's a question. Following up on that, how do we take the people in the Rust Belt, the ones that Joan C. Williams talks about as the white working class?
Yes.
How do we move? I don't know that we can move them physically, but how do we get them involved in this so that they can move beyond the anger, the frustration, the despair that occurred when one of my friends said when major industries broke the employment contract, not taking care of workers, not thinking about the effect that moving jobs off, outsourcing jobs or closing down factories, not thinking about what that was going to do in terms of impact. How do we get them involved in this?
I absolutely love that question. So in our path that I alluded to earlier, where we're going to take our loop from Sydney, Nebraska, and take it all the way to the East Coast, we intentionally chose the Rust Belt. So we're going to go from Nebraska through Iowa into Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and then New York and Boston. So going through those regions is going to do a few things. Number one, we're going to need to hire a bunch of people to just bore our tunnel. And incidentally, every 30 or 40 miles at least, maybe even every 5 or 10 miles, we're going to pop up out of ground and put up a cell tower for the new 5G, right? And probably electric vehicle charging stations and other infrastructure around that as we're following these highways and freeways in rural areas as well as urban areas. That's going to create a tremendous amount of jobs. There are already wonderful organizations out there, nonprofits and other organizations and NGOs that train people who have been in older industries and help them transition into wind and solar. You know what the fastest growing job in America has been for the last 4 years in a row? Wind turbine technician. And the second fastest growing job is a solar installer or a solar technician. So there is a tremendous need because wind and solar are growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, the most capacity that's been added to our grid in terms of new power plants, the last 6 years in a row, wind and solar have been more than half. And in fact, in some years, it's like 2/3 to 80% of the new power plants that are added are renewable energy. And that's why it's creating so many new jobs. And we're talking tens of billions of dollars every year already. And our technology is simply going to accelerate that even more. And so there's a huge opportunity for a transition for people that have skills in whether it's coal mining or oil and gas drilling or manufacturing that are going to need to make more solar panels and more inverters and more of all of the electrical components, wind turbine blades, you name it. Manufacturing in the U.S. of wind and solar components is large, but it's going to get a lot larger. And we need those people with those skills to make that transition.
And Troy, that I did a book years ago called One World, One People, and a quote that I unearthed that did not make it into the book comes from the Arabic, which is to keep your eye on the stars, but tie your camel to a tree.
I love it.
So certainly one of the more entrenched political forces that kind of goes unnoticed, I think, in the United States are all of these utility boards and utility commissions, state by state or even regionally. Is there going to be a resistance to those folks that the established order and established political donations and all that complexity goes with it? It seems to me to be a pretty entrenched barrier. How does the new guy deal with that as an executive, as a promoter of this incredible idea?
Yeah, look, I've been dealing with that my whole career. I mean, when I started the wind company in Kansas, a very conservative, very red state that relied and still relies heavily on fossil fuels, although last year they exceeded 30% of the state's electric demand was met by wind power. So that was a big milestone for Kansas. But that's just one state, one example. But I got death threats multiple times. In 2000, 2001, I think even in 1999, myself and Jim and Matt on my team, because we were developing, new wind farms, and it was viewed as a threat. Some of the people and companies that have made a lot of money for many, many decades, as you just described, in that whole political system. I actually started a second book called Caveman Country, how our country is controlled by this caveman mentality of digging things up and burning it. But the attitude is a lot different now. I mean, there's so many billions of dollars, tens of billions, as I mentioned, flowing into clean energy every year. There's more capital out there from Wall Street and other, pension funds, infrastructure funds, you name it. Insurance companies, they now view solar and wind as safe, predictable asset classes. In fact, safer than fossil fuels. Insurance companies view it the same way, because with fossil, you still always have the exploration risk. Is a well going to go dry? Transportation risk, freezing natural gas in Texas, coal on trains, you name it. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of complication. Whereas wind and solar, they're capital intensive to build them, and that cost is now about the same cost as building a coal or a gas plant, far less than a nuclear plant. But you have very low, almost no operating cost. I mean, you have some, but you have no fuel cost. Unless somehow somebody starts to put a tax on sunshine and wind, there's no fuel cost. So anyway, to answer the question, sure, that's going to be a transition. Same thing happened when we switched from whale oil to kerosene. Same thing happened when we switched from horse and buggy to automobiles. Anytime an industry goes through a massive transformation like this, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be upset and fighting the change, fighting the inertia of that. But it is inevitable because the economics now are so powerful that wind and solar will beat, hands down, coal, gas, and nuclear anywhere.
And Robert, one of the things that we can be assured that a death threat to Troy, he's got two things on his side. He's got the original SEAL, Navy SEAL, who has got his back. And then if he has to, he can just turn his, what is it that the boring machine uses in the front?
Plasma.
Plasma. He can just turn the plasma on it, right through the phone.
Well, and don't forget, I'm also an American Ninja Warrior. I've been invited to be on that show four times.
Oh, my goodness. All right. Troy, this has been wonderful. This is really wonderful to see and hear the predictions that are coming in this very short 3-year period. We're going to be seeing some holes dug, right?
We are. It's going to be so exciting.
Good. Well, I'm looking forward to getting the deck from you so we can share it with some of the people down here who are looking for these kind of projects to invest in. How would you like to leave our audience?
Yeah, I would just want to tell your audience and your listeners to have hope. You hear a lot of disheartening news about climate change and, what can we possibly do as one person, and is this going to get better? For those who care about, Mother Earth and the environment and our children and grandchildren, clean air, clean water, clean food, there's hope. We have the technology, the economics are there, and companies like mine, and there's many others out there that are coming up with clever technologies that are going to enable a more rapid transformation to a cleaner, safer, healthier world.
And a strong amount, large number of very good jobs.
Absolutely. It's going to stimulate the economy in a huge way. And we won't have to rely on imported energy anymore. And we'll have homegrown energy and a huge number of jobs taking care of these solar and wind projects and new transmission all over the country.
Excellent. Well, Robert, why don't you close us out for today?
Well, once again, I'm going to call on Bucky Fuller. My friend, longtime friend, the late John Denver, quoted Bucky quite often. He said that part of his purpose in life was to contribute toward a you and me world instead of a you or me world. We're living in a culture right now that's going through wrenching change around opposing camps. And it's like the opposite of you and me. The way that I experience you, Troy, is that you're not like some philosopher. You know your business, and it's a business that involves dirt and digging and a lot of investment. It's not airy-fairy, and it's not software. It's real work. And it's in those areas, it seems to me, that you or me tends to predominate in terms of a consciousness around the business world, around the media, around politics. I just see tremendous win-win-win possibilities for what you're doing. I admire it. I have some sense, based on my life experience, of how challenging it must be sometimes. It's just an absolute delight to be in this conversation with you, applaud you, encourage you, and to learn about something that's new and exciting and has such potential for the human family.
Thank you, Robert.
And we may have to change the name of our podcast sometime from the not so famous to the soon to be famous.
Well,
very good.
We'll see about that.
Thanks, Troy. I look forward to our next conversation. Take care.
All the best.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, there you heard it. Some more conversations with some not so famous achievers, at least not yet. Right here in Orange County's only community radio station, octalkradio.net. Streaming live from the University of California, Irvine's Beale Applied Innovation Center.